Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we began our discussion of poetry. We made attempts to define it, understand what makes it different from normal language, and identify some poetic devices that might be useful in our own writing. Today, we're going to continue and deepen our discussion by focusing in particular on issues of diction and syntax, which we touched on just a bit last time. As we do this, we'll need to address the need to pay attention to matters of connotation, association, and the particular difficulties caused by the nature of the English language itself, because it is one of the few languages that has so many potential synonyms for certain words. It's interesting that English is one of those languages in which it's necessary for every school child to learn how to use a thesaurus. And as you certainly remember from your elementary school days, a thesaurus is a book that lists synonyms for various words. And it's a useful thing to have if you want to avoid repeating the same word over and over in a piece of writing. For example, you can describe something as fast or quick or speedy or even moving with alacrity, and they all mean roughly the same thing. English has an unusually large vocabulary drawn from a number of different languages that come from different branches on the family tree of languages. A lot of other languages have no need of books like a thesaurus. This huge smorgasbord of words in English is one of the great things about our language, but we have so many options that it can also be problematic, as you'll see in a moment. Consider the following sentence. We have to come up with some kind of scheme to deal with this. Okay, so upon hearing this, what are your immediate reactions? Is the person who said this honest, trustworthy? Why or why not? What you're probably focusing on is the word scheme. What if the sentence had read instead something like, we have to come up with some kind of plan to deal with this? How do you feel about the speaker now? Is the speaker honest, trustworthy, or maybe you just can't tell one way or another? Well, if you look up the word scheme and plan in a dictionary or a thesaurus, they're usually given a simple equivalence of one another. But in addition to a word's definition, there is also a word's connotation or association to consider. In American English, as well as some other versions, the word scheme has negative associations. It connotes something illegal, underhanded, or deceptive. It's a plan, sure, but not any plan in which a law-abiding citizen wants to be involved. You might hear any number of villains described as scheming or otherwise planning dastardly deeds. A word closer to scheme than plan might be plot, as many bad guys in books and movies hatch nefarious plots to enrich themselves, or else they plot their revenge. Again, these three words, scheme, plot, and plan, have essentially the same definition, but the nuances of connotation mean that they can indicate positive or negative qualities of the person or thing with which they're associated. When I teach history of the English language, I try to get my students to appreciate how huge the vocabulary of English is by giving them an assignment in which they have to take a famous speech or poem or song, and then they have to rewrite it using only words that are native to the English language. And when they're doing this exercise, I also make them note the origin, or what we call the etymology, of the non-native words. Do those words come from Latin? Do they come from Greek? Do they come from French, etc., etc.? And let me tell you, I have gotten some pretty interesting versions of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address out of this assignment. For example, the word perish in the famous lines, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's not a native English word. It comes into Middle English around the year 1200 via French, but it's not found in Old English, and that's where I have my students start, with the language spoken by the Anglo-Saxon peoples who invaded Britain starting in the 5th century. That's where English ultimately has its roots. And since perish isn't found in Old English, students have to change that word. In trying to find a native English workaround, they often find they have to change the whole structure of that line, and everyone is pretty dissatisfied with what they come up with. Shall not die out on earth is the most common rewrite I get, but it lacks the power and the punch and the rhythm that using the word perish gives that line. Now, when I give this assignment, my students are explicitly forbidden from using the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was famous for trying as hard as he could to use only native English words in his writing. So obviously, if you're a student in my class and you pick a Hopkins poem for this project, you'd have the assignment completed in about 5 minutes, and you really wouldn't have learned much of anything. So you can understand the point I'm making here. Now, to make it even clearer, I've slightly rewritten one of Hopkins' best-known poems, and what I've done here is I've replaced several of his more colorful, interesting words with what I think, at least, are less exciting ones. This poem is called Pied Beauty, and for it to make sense, you need to know that pied, spelled P-I-E-D, means having patches or spots of 2 or more colors. So here's my version, with most of what seemed the most interesting words replaced. I haven't changed everything, but I think I've changed enough so that when you compare the 2 versions, you'll hear and understand a real difference. So again, here's my version. Glory be to God for multicolored things, for skies of more than one color as a spotted cow, for reddish spots, all spotted, upon trout that swim, fresh roasted chestnuts as the shell falls off, finches' wings, landscaped, arranged, and divided, dip, unplanted land, and plowed land, and all professions, their equipment and tools and apparatus. All things in opposition, original, unadorned, unusual, whatever is inconstant, spotted, who knows how, with quick, slow, sweet, sour, shining, dim. He gives birth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. So what's your reaction to this poem? Does it describe multicolored or spotted things? Well, yes, indeed it does. Do you understand what the poet is trying to say? Probably. Essentially, Hopkins is saying that things that are multicolored or dappled have a unique beauty, from animals to nuts to the land to those who work at a trade or a craft. In several places, I used words that mean the same things as what Hopkins was trying to say in essence, but I used a word that's very common today, like the word profession, which I use to take the place of a simpler word, but one that has an older connotation. In that position, Hopkins uses trades, where I said profession. What else could I have said? Well, how about career? That would work too, but neither profession nor career has the same connotation as trade. And I think that's a word that suggests not just what one does for a living, but that one works with one's hands to earn one's living. Okay, but that's enough of me. Let's go back to Hopkins' original poem in all its glory. This is it. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Now, what do you think of that version? Do you understand what he's trying to say? The answer is probably not so much if you're just hearing it for the first time. In many ways, this poem overwhelms the senses with its sound and rhythm. The first time listening to it, a lot of the words probably don't even make any sense. brinded, stipple, and adazzle are all words that no one I know uses on a regular basis. And even words we do know, like plotted, fallow, and even plow, are used here in arrangements that we don't normally encounter. They're put together here in combinations that make greatest use of their sounds, of alliteration or words that begin with the same sound, of assonance or repetition of the same vowel sounds within words, and of consonants, or the use of a similar consonant sound in a series of words. And to be sure, Hopkins uses many more poetic devices than just these, but for our purposes today, these are the major ones that stand out, especially in a line like landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow. There's even some good old-fashioned rhyme in there, but it's not in a pattern that's easy to follow or typical of more simplistic poetry. Let's listen to that first stanza one more time. And I really think you can't listen to Hopkins too much. Always room for one more listen. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-coal chestnut falls, finch's wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim. Now the second time through, what new things did you pick up on? Well, for one, you might have noticed the rhyming pattern a little bit more. It's much more complex than a simple rhyming couplet, but there is rhyme there, and it's a really compelling kind of rhyme. Now, if you can remember back that far, it's been a few minutes now, how do you think that compares with my rather simplified version, in which I replaced some of the more interesting words with different ones? To be sure, in my version, I'm betting that getting the meaning and getting a clear idea of all the images that are being evoked, it's still more difficult than in the first altered version I gave you. My version is probably a little clearer. Hopkins is probably a little less clear. But which would you say is more beautiful or more compelling? I'm betting and I'm hoping that at least 90% of you prefer Hopkins' original version, even if it makes you work harder to try and understand it. Because, frankly, sometimes it's the hard that makes it good. As readers or listeners, your full attention is demanded, is claimed, as you try to work out what's going on here. And there certainly is delight to be had in savoring the sound, even if you're not at all getting the meaning right away. In fact, there are some poems famously that are all about sound. For example, Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, composed the poem called Jabberwocky, which is full of words that almost sound like real words, or maybe a combination of real words, but it's not quite there. Here are a few lines from Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe." Okay, what'd you get out of that? Anything? Well, if we start to break it down, you'll see that at the very least, even if the words are nonsense, you have an idea of what function the nonsense words are serving in this poem. Like, let's think about the first line again. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves." Okay, what have you got with that? Well, the poem begins by telling us that twas, brillig. What the heck is brillig? And this is spelled B-R-I-L-L-I-G. I have no idea, but I could guess that it's meant to be an adjective or a word describing when all these events are happening. So just substitute something like, "It was evening," or "It was beautiful," and you'll see what I mean. Now, the second half of that line, "and the slithy toves," we're doing something. What is slithy? What are toves? Well, slithy is probably an adjective that modifies toves, which I'm guessing, and I bet you are too, some kind of noun. So slithy toves could be something like slimy frogs, for example. And what are these slithy toves doing? Well, We can tell from the syntax that they're performing actions and that these actions include gyring and gimbaling. Did gyre and gimbal in the wabe. You get the picture. Even though it's nonsense, if we engage the poem, if we really start to think about it, our brains start to fill in at least some of the blanks and we can start to make some kind of sense of it. Now, would I suggest that you use nonsense words in your own writing to try and get your readers to pay really close attention as they figure out what it was you're trying to say? No, I wouldn't. You don't want to make your readers work too hard because some of them may just give up and stop reading, and we definitely don't want that. But at the same time, the examples of Hopkins and Carroll show the power that words can have, not just in their meaning, but in their sound as well. And that's something to which we should all be paying attention as both readers and writers. Okay, so we've established that word choice is an important consideration when you're writing, no matter what it is that you're writing, and that learning some lessons about this from poetry can help make your own writing more interesting and engaging. But it's not just word choice that can have an impact. Word order is also important. What I'm talking about here is syntax, or the grammatical ordering of a sentence so that it makes sense. For example, let's take the sentence, "The king married the queen." Okay, this makes perfect sense. But if we mess with the syntax so that the same words read this way, queen, king, the married, well, this makes no sense at all. The sentence, "The king married the queen," is a perfect example of the most common sentence structure in English, what we would call subject, verb, object. And when I'm grading student essays, I frequently find myself writing, "Try to vary your sentence structure." And I write this in the margins of any number of papers, as very often people only write subject, verb, object sentences because that's what they know how to do, and they know how to do it correctly. So they'd rather use the same form over and over and get it right than attempt something more complex, which might be more interesting, but which has greater opportunity for them to screw up. So let's take 3 sentences in a row that use subject, verb, object, and think about how they sound and whether or not they're interesting or engaging. The king married the queen. They lived in a castle. They were good rulers. All right, do you want to keep reading if the whole paper or article follows this structure? Most of us would say probably not. Why? Because it's boring. Now, what if we change the syntax a bit? What if we said, "The king and queen, they got married. In a castle they lived and ruled well." Okay, that might seem a little stilted, but hands down, it is way more interesting than "The king married the queen. They lived in a castle. They were good rulers." Poetry can be a good teacher when it comes to understanding syntax as well as word choice. And perhaps the poet to most famously play with matters of syntax is E.E. Cummings. And I'll show you what I mean. Here's the opening of Cummings' poem, "Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town." Anyone lived in a pretty how town, with up so floating many bells down. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, he sang his didn't, he danced his did. All right, what do you make of those lines? Even though we can't do a really accurate translation by simply correcting the syntax or changing the word choice, we get some images and we get some idea about what the poet's trying to convey. If you had to paraphrase this or guess what's happening, what would you say? Well, we could start with the basics. There's someone who lives in a town, apparently, and it seems as if maybe there are church bells that ring in this town, perhaps throughout the year, and this person maybe sings and dances, or maybe he doesn't. Anyone lived in a pretty how town, with up so floating many bells down. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, he sang his didn't, he danced his did. Okay, you could make all sorts of interpretations that are very different from the one I've just suggested, but you get the point that even though the syntax is confusing, some images, a town, bells, the seasons, can still be discerned if we think hard about it. And again, it's that mystery. It is what is hard or initially confusing about this poem that makes it so good and so interesting. But also, again, I would not suggest that you just throw the words of your article or story up on the page in random order and leave it to your reader to sort it out. But you could try to vary your word order as a means of engaging your reader. So now, by way of example, let's consider 3 versions of the opening of a short story, and you try to determine which version you think is the most effective. Okay, here's the first one. And the story begins, "It was the week after the big rain. I was with my mother in the market. We each had baskets over our arms. My feet were getting muddy. I was tired and wanted to go home. Then I heard shouting on the other side of the square." Okay, what do we think of this? Well, we certainly understand what's happening. There's a speaker. The speaker describes when and where she is, what the weather's like, and the fact that she wants to go home. Then, something potentially very interesting starts to happen when the shouting is mentioned. It's certainly clear, this passage, but is it really compelling? Maybe it's interesting enough, but let's consider a revised version that plays a little bit with word choice and sentence structure. Here's the second version. "For a week, the big rains had been over, and finally it was dry enough for us to venture out to the market. My mother and I each with a basket slung over an arm. Mud was creeping up through the soles of my shoes, and the weary ache in my shoulders was beginning to make me long for home, when suddenly the cheery calm of the market was shattered by shouting on the other side of the square." What's different here? Well, the basic information is the same, but the language is more interesting. The rains are over. But now we know not just that the rain is over, but that it was so wet the mother and daughter didn't even want to try to go to the market. The first few sentences of the original version are now combined into one that flows a little more engagingly and smoothly, and the speaker's tiredness is conveyed much more compellingly. She's not just tired, but she feels weary in her bones. And this shouting that draws her attention is described more excitingly. It shatters the, quote, cheery calm of the market. And that's a phrase that suggests much more about this market scene than what we got in the first version. We could imagine that there's a lot of activity, but that everyone's in a pretty good mood. And so it makes a much stronger contrast when we get to the part about the shouting. Okay, so arguably, the second version is more compelling than the first. Or, at least we could say, it's more interesting in terms of its descriptive terms and sentence structure. Could you ever go too far? Well, indeed, yes, you could. Let's consider another version of the opening of this story. Quote, "A week after the tears from heaven ended, my mother and I were in the bustling, happy chaos of the market, where food and gossip alike were bought and sold. We each had an empty cornucopia waiting to be filled on our arms. A slurry of dirt and water was gradually breaching the barrier of leather that encased my feet, and a great weariness, far beyond my years, was kindling a yearning in my heart for the warm comforts of my own hearth, when a fusillade of shouting ripped the tranquility of market day at the seams." Okay, so do you find this passage interesting? Probably a lot of us would say, well, yes. And if you were going to go on and ask yourself, do you think this writer is trying too hard? Most of us would probably also answer yes to that question. If you can, in some sense, see the sweat of the writer's labor, recognize where he or she turned to the thesaurus for a more complicated word when a simple one would do, then you know that you're in the presence of a writer who's perhaps not a master of the craft, but is trying to seem as if he or she is. The trick for any good writer is to write compelling, beautiful prose, and make no mistake, that takes a lot of hard work, but you also don't want too much of your labor to show. The writer of the third version of that opening passage has read a little too much poetry and is a little too excited to employ poetic devices and complicated phrases where the simple would do just fine. On the other hand, the writer of the first passage is a little too cautious, a little too afraid to move beyond the borders of what's comfortable and what he or she knows he or she can do right. As I said in one of our earliest lectures, one of the keys to being a good writer is knowing how to give your reader enough information while also exercising sufficient restraint. You want to engage and enthrall your reader. You don't want to overwhelm your audience with flowery phrases that totally obscure the main message of your writing. All right, so how do you get from version 1 to version 2 of the story opening I read you without risking descent into what is arguably a kind of poetic madness that will get you version 3? As with any type of writing, it's practice that makes perfect, or at least readable, and practice certainly involves lots and lots of reading. The more you read of all kinds of writing, the better you will be as a writer. If you talk to great practitioners of their crafts, be it writers or artists or musicians, one thing you usually discover is that they're all sort of omnivorous consumers of works within their trades. Great musicians tend to appreciate all kinds of music. I myself have known an alternative rocker or two who profess undying love for Patsy Cline or Tchaikovsky. And I've heard of famous abstract artists who find inspiration in the very carefully faithful-to-life portraits of artists such as Rembrandt or Vermeer. I've also heard writers of science fiction describe their fondness for a well-written autobiography. In other words, read, and you will start to learn how to write. Now, of course, the other piece of advice is simply to write and to have as many eyes as possible look at what you are writing. This is a case where you certainly can learn by doing, and the more you do, the better you get. Practice what you've learned from today's and the other lectures so far over and over and over again, and you'll really start to get the hang of it. The exercises for today's lecture will help you get started with this. I've given you a few sentences that I want you to try and rewrite so that the structure is different and a little more interesting. But you don't have to stop at the examples I've given you. You can play this kind of game every day, all day long in real life. Billboards, ads on TV, flyers posted on telephone poles. These and other pieces of text we look at every day by the thousands can be your practice space. I do this all the time in elevators that have ads in them. Our breakfast buffet is the best in town, one might say. And in my head, I rewrite it so that it says, the best in town is how people describe our breakfast buffet. Another ad might say, the lowest prices on widgets. And in my head, I rewrite it so it's more interesting, and it says something like, lower prices on widgets? You can't find them anywhere. So today we learned how word choice and word order are important as you think about your own writing, and we looked at several examples from the genre of poetry that help to make this important point really clear. In our next lecture, we're going to move from poetry to the genre of drama, and we're going to discuss how understanding the conventions of performance on stage can help us be better readers and writers, and more specifically, help us prepare for moments when we might be expected to speak in public. How is the spoken word different from the written one, and why does it matter? We're going to try and answer that question in our next lecture.